In the historical archive of human sports, the hardwood of the basketball court has always been regulated by strict, unyielding laws of nature. If you were born a giant, the world dictated your destiny before you could even speak. You were placed under the rim, your movements were mechanical, your footsteps were heavy, and your purpose was simple: absorb impact, protect the glass, and survive the grueling wear and tear of a body too massive for its own skeletal frame. For decades, basketball evolved within these parameters. Speed belonged to the guards, power belonged to the forwards, height belonged to the centers. The boundaries were clear, and the world was comfortable with those limitations. But then, from the suburban shadows of Le Chesnay, France, a walking glitch in the matrix emerged to tear down every physical and tactical law ever written. Standing at an impossible 7 feet 4 inches, armed with a terrifying 8-foot wingspan, he did not just enter the sport, he invaded it. When LeBron James, a man who has witnessed every tier of basketball greatness for over 20 years, first laid eyes on this teenager, he refused to use the word prodigy. He looked into the cameras, shook his head in absolute disbelief, and called him an alien. His name is Victor Wembanyama, and his story is not an accident of genetics. It is the most meticulously calculated takeover in the history of modern athletics. The world wants to believe that Victor is simply a freak of nature, a lucky byproduct of DNA that automatically grants dominance. This assumption is the first great lie of the Wembanyama narrative. The truth is far more dangerous. Victor's body is a weapon, but his mind is the master engineer. To understand the terrifying entity he has become today in the NBA, you have to travel back to his childhood, where his father, Felix, a former elite triple jumper, and his mother, Elodie, a basketball coach and former player, realized that a child destined to grow this massive needed a completely different blueprint for survival. They didn't push him into early, destructive weightlifting or grind his joints down in chaotic street matches. Instead, Victor's training was a clinical masterclass in human mechanics. While other young players across Europe and America were focusing on flashy crossovers and heavy squats, Victor was sitting on gymnasium floors, barefoot, performing bizarre, agonizing exercises to strengthen the thousands of tiny tendons in his feet and toes. He was taught to move with the fluid grace of a contemporary dancer rather than the rigid stance of a traditional big man. His flexibility was treated like a sacred religion, and his core strength was developed to ensure that his high center of gravity would never become his weakness. He was a laboratory experiment of patience, built from the ground up to endure the unendurable, engineered specifically to handle a physical load that had broken every historic giant before him, from Yao Ming to Ralph Sampson. By the time he was a teenager tearing through the professional leagues in France with Nanterre, Asvel, and eventually Metropolitans 92, the whispers across the Atlantic Ocean had turned into a roaring panic. The American media machine, famous for its hyperbole, began to manufacture an unprecedented wave of hype. Scouts were flying across the globe just to catch a glimpse of a 7'4" teenager who could effortlessly cross over a defender at the top of the key, step back behind the three-point line, and snap the net with the delicate wrist release of Steph Curry, only to sprint back on defense and block a shot with his arm extended above the top of the backboard. The hype was suffocating, a psychological weight that had destroyed countless young careers before they ever took off. Critics and traditional analysts sat in television studios, smugly predicting his downfall. They said his skinny frame would be snapped in half by the brutal physicality of the NBA. They claimed that grown, battle-tested men like Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic would bully him out of the paint, that the sheer velocity of the American game would expose his stamina, and that the immense psychological pressure of a desperate franchise would crush his spirit. They doubted his durability, questioned his heart, and waited eagerly for the alien to fall flat on his face. They doubted every single dynamic of his existence, until the day they actually had to watch him play. When the San Antonio Spurs secured the number 1 overall pick in the 2023 NBA draft, the basketball universe knew that destiny had aligned perfectly. Under the legendary, uncompromising tutelage of coach Greg Popovich, the mastermind who had previously polished the greatness of David Robinson and Tim Duncan, Victor wasn't just handed a basketball jersey, he was handed the keys to an empire. His rookie season did not just meet expectations, it completely broke the collective sanity of basketball analysts worldwide. He moved through the league not as a learning rookie, but as an apex predator disguised as a teenager. In his very first year, he achieved things that veterans chase for 15 seasons and never touch. He became the youngest player in NBA history to record a 5x5 game, a highly rare, legendary statistical feat where a player records at least 5 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, 5 steals, and 5 blocks in a single night. He was covering ground that defied human biology. Defensively, he didn't just guard players, he hijacked entire offensive schemes. Elite NBA guards, known for their fearless drives to the rim, would drive past their primary defender, catch a glimpse of Victor's massive shadow looming in the paint, and literally stop midair, turn around, and pass the ball away in sheer survival instinct. He won the Rookie of the Year award unanimously, leaving no room for debate, no space for detractors, and sending a bone-chilling message to the rest of the world. The regular laws of basketball were officially dead. But a rookie campaign of historical proportions was merely the opening act. As the clock kept ticking, Victor Wembanyama, world scrambling for answers. He was no longer just a tall kid with good instincts. He had become the most devastating defensive force on the planet, capturing the Defensive Player of the Year award as the youngest recipient in the history of the sport, and doing so as a historic unanimous selection. Think about the gravity of that milestone. A league filled with hyper-athletic veterans, dominant champions, and elite defensive specialists, all collectively agreeing without a single dissenting vote that a young man from France was the undisputed absolute king of defense. He led the NBA in blocks per game for consecutive seasons, joining legendary defensive gods like Dikembe Mutombo and Marcus Camby as the only players to ever accomplish such a feat. With Victor anchored in the paint, his team skyrocketed to the top tiers of defensive efficiency, turning the area inside the three-point line into a literal no-fly zone, a territory where opponents' dreams went to die at the tips of his fingers. The true horror for the rest of the NBA, however, is that his defensive mastery is only half of the equation. Offensively, Victor transformed into a completely unguardable nightmare, averaging elite numbers while shooting with insane efficiency from the field and unlocking a deadly percentage from beyond the arc. He is no longer just floating on the perimeter, he is orchestrating the game. If you put a smaller, quicker player on him, he simply seals them in the post and drops a hook shot from an altitude they cannot even see. If you put a traditional heavy center on him, he brings them out to the perimeter, hits them with a lightning-fast crossover that leaves them stuck in the mud, and steps back into a high-arching three-pointer that is physically impossible to contest. His statistical dominance broke through the regular season barriers and leaked directly into the highest pressure cooker in sports, the NBA playoffs. In high-stakes postseason matchups, Victor put on performances that forced historians to dust off old record books from the eras of Shaquille O'Neal, Hakeem Olajuwon, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. In legendary playoff games, he exploded for close to 40 points, 15 rebounds, and 5 blocks in a single night, leaving modern superstars and seasoned coaches shaking their heads in absolute awe. What makes Victor Wembanyama an unmitigated nightmare for his rivals is not just his box score efficiency, but the deep, existential psychological trauma he inflicts on his opponents. Basketball is a game built on angles, space, and muscle memory. For 50 years, an NBA player knew exactly how much space they needed to get a shot off over a defender. They knew exactly how high a floating layup needed to be to clear an elite rim protector. Victor has completely erased those parameters. He closes distances that should take 3 steps in a single, fluid stride. He blocks shots that players think are completely safe, reaching out from angles that seem mathematically impossible. He is a psychological parasite inside the minds of his opponents. When players step onto the court against him, they stop playing their regular game and start playing a game dictated entirely by where Victor is standing. If he is on the left side, the offense tilts completely to the right. If he enters the screen, the ball handler freezes. He has turned his structural uniqueness into a psychological weapon of mass destruction, forcing the most confident athletes on earth to look up at him and feel an emotion they have never felt in their entire lives: absolute helplessness. Yet, Despite the millions of dollars flowing into his bank account, the global endorsements, the historic accolades, and the worship of millions of fans, the most fascinating aspect of Victor Wembanyama remains the quiet, unyielding discipline of the human being beneath the jersey. He has not allowed the intoxicating poison of modern celebrity culture to alter his frequency. He does not engage in manufactured social media feuds, he does not chase cheap clout, and he does not walk around with the loud, abrasive arrogance that often defines young superstars. Instead, he speaks with the calm, calculated cadence of a philosopher. He looks at his basketball career not as a way to achieve fame, but as an artistic and scientific pursuit of perfection. He reads books, protects his sleep schedule like a professional asset, and returns to the quiet discipline of his training routines every single morning with the hunger of an undrafted rookie. This mental fortitude is his real superpower. The media tried to build a hype machine around him that would blow up his ego and break his focus, but Victor simply looked at the machine, mastered it, and stayed focused on his work. He understands that his unique body is a rare gift, but he also knows that gifts are useless without an ironclad work ethic to back them up. As we stand here today, looking at the unfolding landscape of professional sports, Victor Wembanyama has officially become the definitive bridge between the basketball we used to know and a terrifying, beautiful future that belongs entirely to him. He survived the greatest storm of media scrutiny in sports history, stepped onto the hardwood, and emerged not as a temporary flash in the pan, but as a permanent, cold-blooded reality. He has redefined the very concept of an athlete, proving that true greatness is a slow-burn process engineered through years of silent foot exercises, rigid mental discipline, and an unwavering commitment to the process. When you sit down to watch Victor play, do not let your eyes get distracted by just the impossible height, the long arms, or the viral, flashy highlights that flood your feeds. Look closer. See the decades of careful, scientific preparation. See the relentless, quiet discipline of a young boy who refused to let the limitations of a giant body define his skill set. See the clinical, calculating mind of a predator who has known from day one that he was born to rule this game. The alien has not just landed, he has taken over the capital, rewritten the Constitution, and established a new global empire. The league will never, ever be the same again. Thank you for joining us on this deep, cinematic journey into the evolution of a generational king. Keep the spirit alive, stay disciplined in your own daily battles, and never, ever forget the human behind the crown.